Happy to welcome Greg Cunningham, who is the Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at US Bank. And then joining us remotely is Elizabeth Nieto, who's the Global Head of Equity and Impact at Spotify. Do we have Elizabeth on the line? Yes. Huh? Yeah. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you? We can hear you. We're just waiting a second to be able to see you. Sorry, just 1 second to get everyone set up. Great. We see you now. Great seeing you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Greg, for joining us. Just a summary of a long and interesting day of discussions. I think we've been talking a lot about diversity and inclusion from the perspective of talent managers. We've really gone through a lot of discussions about metrics on performance, on well-being. And this last session, we sort of want to put that into a bigger context. We want to talk about the S in ESG. With that, I think I would like to just get both of you to tell us a little bit about what you do and what you think that S stands for, because I think even the definition is a little bit broad. So, Greg?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
The S in ESG is an interesting one, obviously, when you put it in the context of social impact. And my job as Chief Diversity Officer at US Bank is really to ensure that we center equity and inclusion in all parts of our business. And that certainly includes work around social impact. And we think about it in really three very specific stakeholder groups who we're trying to serve in our work with the S. Number one is our employees, ensuring that we are creating a culture of inclusion and belonging so that they can grow in their careers. Number two, we think of individuals and families, and how do we help individuals and families thrive financially. And then the third one is how do we help communities where we live, work, and play. How do we help communities prosper? And obviously, as a bank, as we lean into the work of ESG, and particularly the S, we think about how do we bring the core competencies of the bank to this work, and I'll talk about specifically how we do that. But that really is my role, is to make sure that we, in the purpose of our organization, which is all about powering human potential, that we do that through the lens of inclusion and do that for all of our stakeholders.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth, I know that you are also sort of overseeing not only the S part, but the E part as well. So maybe if you can talk to us a little bit about what does that S mean for you, but also how does it interact within Spotify?
Thank you. And yes, building on what Greg said, under the equity and impact umbrella, we have diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Should I go louder? What about now?
No, I think it's good. Yeah, I think just we can raise the volume, but we can hear you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so diversity, inclusion, and belonging, very similar to what Greg was saying. How do we look for diversity, inclusion for our DAO members, and how we call our employees at Spotify. And then we also have responsibilities for social impact, and that's looking both at the creators, that's our supply chain, and our communities, and also I have responsibilities for sustainability and climate action. So that's why I have the E and the S. And we look at that through the lenses of some alignment between the work that we do internally, the work that we do with our communities and our creators, but also understanding that sustainability and climate change will have the most negative impact on marginalized communities. So that's why when we make decisions around the impact of the work in climate change, we do that through the lenses of also the S in social impact and also our employees' experience.
Great, thank you. And I think, sort of from what you both have said, we get a sense that this is more than just within the company, right? But it's also how the company interacts with the community, you know, in Spotify is also how it interacts with creators, in banking, how it interacts with
Customers.
investors, customers.
Yeah.
So maybe if we can talk a little bit about how your job around that stakeholder management is, and maybe how it differs a little bit between the banking industry and the music industry.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many stakeholders, and I think, and I was listening to the previous speaker who talked about the shift in how, you know, companies are making decisions, and it used to be a time when, you know, we thought about what we can do for the company, and I think, you know, future generations and current generations are also thinking about, you know, how does the company's values align with mine? And so from an employee perspective, I think we use our employee resource groups, you know, as a central component of not only defining our culture, but also how we make business decisions and how we lean in on issues that are important to our employees. So the employees are truly a resource, not only from a talent perspective, but a resource in how we shape our values and how we shape decisions around where we lean in on social issues. In terms of other stakeholders, certainly, you know, customers are in control. I don't care what industry you're in. Customers have a lot of say in how, you know, companies are sort of not only designing products and services that they bring to market, but also in how they show up and make decisions around social issues. And so we do a lot of listening to customers in terms of, you know, how we develop points of view and policy and issues that are aligned around our values. And then third, certainly you have communities, investor communities, and you know, we just spent a lot of time. We recently got regulatory approval on an acquisition on a bank right here in California, Union Bank. And what's important about that is we actually spent over 12 hours listening to over 200 community organizations about their concerns, challenges that they saw. And so we developed this community benefit plan in partnership with many community organizations. And so all three of those stakeholder groups are vitally important to your value proposition as an organization, and certainly shaping your purpose.
Elizabeth?
I love that, you know, users, stakeholders, customers, they are the ones driving what we're producing. So for us, the same thing is how do we create a better environment, more sustainable and equitable, and our responsibility to do that from our brand perspective. We do have this other arm in our case of the art creators who also are looking to put in their creation, their art in organizations that have the same values that they have. So there is a lot of synergy in many cases in understanding. If we think about climate change, we're the artists that have a point of view that want to engage with us as a company, but also engage with our listeners. When we think about climate action, a lot of the things that we usually that we think is just, you know, how we reduce emissions, and yes, that is one of the things that as a company we're looking into doing, but we're also looking into how do we educate. How do we take advantage of the voice that we have ourselves and our creators to engage with the broader society so we can go and really have an impact on the climate, not just by emissions reduction, but it's very, very important, but also by engaging in more than just organizations, but the broader societies in the goal of, you know, changing our circumstances of today.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very interesting, and sort of what I hear is there's a lot of competing interests within competing stakeholders, right? We hear, for example, a lot of employees care about social issues, right? Or environmental issues, and then you have other stakeholders who have competing views or incentives, you know, and I'm guessing your jobs is to try to sort of get them all some sort of consensus or help them prioritize one over the other, or, you know, find some common ground and some agreement about what's important and what's the right position. So I'm just curious to hear how you think through this?
Navigate
and how
that.
do you manage like top diplomats, I imagine?
Yeah, I probably am in the wrong career. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I think you were going to say something.
I was going to say, setting priorities is not an easy topic because many of the topics that employees care about are things that we also care about, and we can't do everything. So, for example, for us at Spotify, civic engagement is one of the most important things that we can do internally and externally. And not everybody believes that that's what we should be doing, but we think that it's important. And maybe not 100 of our employees are with us, but 100%. But some of them are. So that has decided, we have decided that was one of the priorities that we will do that, and we'll do that in a nonpartisan way around the world. So we have the ability to create information, meet people for registration, for meaningful workers, for whatever makes sense for each one of the markets. And as I said, maybe other people will want us to be doing some other work related to social impact, but that's the one that we can fix. Because when you try to do everything, you have very low impact on a lot of things. So setting up priorities is difficult. And you have to look at what is authentic to your brand or to your company. Not that other things are not important for us to say, and civic engagement is going to be one area of work, and we're staying with that. And ensuring that our employees understand why that is important and that why we're making the decision to do this work around the world.
I think as an organization, you have a mission statement and a purpose statement for a reason, and that should always serve as your GPS, if you will, and a filter for how you make decisions. And there's always going to be somebody, a group who's not going to appreciate, or align around a decision that you make. But when you make values-based decisions and you use your purpose as an organization as a way to think through some of these issues, I think you, more often than not, you'll stay true to yourself and get it right. The other thing I think is important is you have to have, Elizabeth said it very well in terms of, setting priorities, and just, when you have, particularly in issues around the S and DEI specifically, when you have goals, and I think there's probably three things that are really important, is you have to have some intentionality around all this work around social impact. Number two, you have to have some sense of accountability. What's interesting about the E that the S doesn't benefit from is there actually is an industry benchmark. Like there's a net zero measurement that everybody can sort of wrap their head around. The S, you don't have that. Like nobody's really cracked the code on how you measure social impact. And so it's something that we're working very hard on, because you have to, I think, in order to make meaningful progress, is you actually have to measure outcomes. It's one thing for companies, and many companies, have recently made really big pronouncements and announcements around social impact investments and all of that, which is great. But I think most people don't care about your $30 billion 10-year investment. I think what they care about is, what does it mean for me and my community? That female entrepreneur who's trying to make payroll, she's trying to understand, well, what is the impact on me? And so I think, getting to this place where you have very specifics, I think people want specifics, and they want them to be time-based. And I think this notion of accountability, and you can substitute the word transparency in there too, because it's not only having goals, but being very transparent to the public about what you're trying to achieve and being able to measure that progress. And then the third thing I think you need is consistency, because it's not always popular to talk about social impact, because or ESG more broadly, because we're in such a polarized time, and it's not always popular, it's not always front page news to have these conversations. And so as an organization, as leaders, you actually have to have some stamina around this. You actually have to do the work when it's not front page news, when it's not popular for you to show up in the room and be talking about inclusion and why we need more representation of women and people of color leaders in the organization. Like, you have to have the courage and the bravery to be very consistent and role model this work in order for it to move forward.
What are some of those outcomes that you measure, and how does you articulate sort of that strategy in US Bank?
Well, I'll answer the second part of the question first. We articulate it through our ESG report, which is public. But, as part of our access commitment, which we launched back in February of 2021, which the folks in the audience should know, US Bank is actually headquartered in Minneapolis, which obviously where George Floyd was murdered, literally 3 miles from our headquarters. And so in February of 2021, we, like many companies, announced this initiative called Access Commitment, which was about closing wealth disparities, particularly in communities of color. And part of that, I said before, which was focusing on, the closing wealth disparities, but we also partnered nationally with the Urban Institute to help us with building that framework for how we were going to measure outcomes. Because nobody has been able to figure out how to measure social impact. So we have a whole theory of change around it. The first round of the report is out. We're still working on the specific metrics around each of the various initiatives, but we felt it important to go to a third-party organization like the Urban Institute, very credible research institute who can really help us think through what is the impact we're trying to have, are we making a difference, and how would we know if we're making a difference? And so we're choosing to work with them to work through that framework. But I think about things like, one of the initiatives we have is about closing home ownership gaps in this country. And, we can measure the number of mortgage loans. We can measure, the number of jobs created through the capital that we lend to small businesses. And so it's really sort of building a framework around all of that. But those are the things that people want to know. It's not just what was the dollar commitment. It's actually, are you creating a job? Are you helping that entrepreneur meet payroll? Because those are the things that make a difference in community.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, you talk about civic engagement. So, in terms of like measuring outcomes, and for Spotify, how does this commitment drive your strategy and the way you work with your employees and with your other stakeholders?
Yeah, this is a good example because we work with non-profit organizations that are working in each one of the countries around civic engagement. So we engage with them so they can track some of the actions, for example, registering for voting or participation. So we don't track directly that as that information is from information that we will have either from our listener, but we can see the tracking from something that we had put on our platform. Open your Spotify early in the morning to listen to your podcast, and then how it goes through someone getting information around, for example, where they can vote or how they can change their address or registration. So that's one thing. But the other thing that I wanted to build on some of the things that Greg was saying. So we are a civic organization, so we have been reporting around sustainability for many years because we are regulated in Sweden, and we had to do that. It was really last year that we changed our reporting strategy to talk about impact. And thinking about what you were saying, Greg, is just not the dollars, but what are the organizations and what are the people that we're directly impacting? So when we do giving, how do we engage with that? And from our creator perspective, we have specific programs around the world, for example, to highlight the voices of women. It's called Equal. And we have been doing that in each one of the markets where we have. So it is not only the money that we put, but really how do we build the skills or the marketing or the podcast experience so we have more voices in the case here could be of women, the LGBT community, the Black community in the markets where we see that they're not represented at the same level that they should. So those are examples of what they're very, very specific, and then we don't just communicate how much money we spend, we really communicate how many more creators we have, or how many more podcasters we have in communities that they didn't have access to that
Greg, you mentioned that on the environmental side of things, one of the things that facilitates working towards that is that there's a common metric now.
Yep.
There's interest from the market and from investors into looking at that. And there has also been a lot of work in making the business case for environmental, right?
Yeah.
There's a very clear bottom line
Yes.
profit aspect to it.
Yeah.
So I think that's another side where the social sustainability area might struggle making that correlation between doing good and profit. So
Yes.
just curious to know, how are you guys thinking about that, and whether there's a case just for doing good without the elements of profitability or not?
You better believe there's a business case for it. And the business case for it is actually the title of your conference. Because I think the business case for diversity and social sustainability, however you want to frame it, is innovation. By definition, the business case for diversity is innovation. It brings greater creativity, decision-making. It allows for discourse and dialogue, people's various life experiences. That's why you're doing it. Like, that's when you think about diversity in any aspect of it, whether it's on a talent side, and why you need representation. It's because of the diverse perspectives and life experience that people bring. If you think about it from a customer perspective, it expands markets and opportunities for you to grow customer acquisition. And so it's all about innovation. And I think the reason that, you could argue diversity initiatives in particular have been unsuccessful in many ways for the last 50 years is because no one's really been able to frame that business case as this duality of doing good and doing well at the same time. We have to pivot these social efforts from being efforts primarily articulated as charitable efforts to, it's not only the right thing to do for our companies, it's actually the smart thing to do for our companies, because we're bringing more customers, clients, listeners, whatever it is, into our community by being more relevant to them, by providing greater value in their lives, helping people solve problems. And it's only until we see these communities as asset-based communities that we start to see the opportunity that it opens up for us. I mean, think about, I probably shouldn't do sports analogies. I told myself I wouldn't.
That's fine.
But think about, but think about golf without Tiger Woods. Like a generation ago, Tiger Woods wouldn't have even been able to play on those courses. Think about tennis without the Williams sisters. What diversity brings, and they're not only incredibly talented and the best at what they do, but the fact that they represent a broader vision of ourselves, it brings more people into the conversation. More people can see themselves a part of it. And so it's only until we can articulate examples of where inclusion, because inclusion needs to mean everybody. Nobody should not see themselves in these conversations we're having around inclusion. But we actually do have to see those people who have historically been left out and or marginalized, because that's how we truly reach our potential as an organization. And no organization can reach their full potential if every person in the organization doesn't feel a sense of belonging, if you're not exploring all the opportunities to reach as many of your customers in the most relevant way. And so we look at it, the business case for it, as truly fulfilling our mission to power human potential. But on the end of that statement should be for everyone.
And Elizabeth, I know you have an interesting perspective on profitability itself, right? Working for now a Swedish company that might think through sort of this bottom line differently. I'm curious to hear how your thoughts on this are similar or differ from what Greg has been talking about.
Yeah, they're very similar, because we look at diversity, inclusion, and belonging as a lever for accessing the best talent in the world. So we can imagine that we know that intelligence is figuring out our whole population. So if you look just 7 years as a public company, so we have the opportunity, or we had the opportunity to go through those values from the very beginning, and build an organization that was thinking about talent of all kind. I think I mentioned to you maybe that our representation of women for a tech company is 3 times higher than the companies that we compare ourselves to. And part of that is because from the very beginning, being a Swedish company, we understood that parental leave is a lever for both men and women. And if only one of them gets parental leave and not the other one, well, the careers of people are not going to go hand in hand. Well, men in the company at the highest level of the organization have taken their 6 months of parental leave. So that's when we start to change the policies around the way that we manage. And then we have great representation, not only at the company level, but also in the tech organization, where more than 34% of our tech leaders are women. So compared to all of the other companies, we feel very confident that we will continue to develop on that. So that's a little bit where we stand. So yeah, so the driver for us, just like Greg, is talent. We want to have talent that also represent the community of our users, and that's the only way that we can make a product that aligns to their needs.
Yeah.
That's good. Talent is so clearly defined in Elizabeth's world, but I love that where talent is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. And that really is the work that I think all of us are doing in the space.
Yeah, and I think that's, zooming into the question of talent, we know now that millennials, Gen Zers, they think about money, they think about benefits, but they also think about purpose, right? That's one of the number one reasons why they make decisions and why they choose companies. When we were talking perhaps about how articulating the social sustainability argument internally could be a challenge, but also how can it be, how do you use it as an opportunity? How do you use it, how do you leverage it to gain a competitive advantage with your competitors or with other industries? How do you see it? How do you use it? How do you market it?
Yeah, how do we market? I don't think it's how we market it. I think it's how we use it to inform decisions. And again, it goes back to what I was saying before. Whatever your organization is, understanding the business that you're in, I think is absolutely crucial. When I talked about our purpose of powering human potential, that is our reason for being. And we just happen to use banking as the vessel to deliver the purpose. And I think you honestly have to think about it that way. And so, when we think about social sustainability, it's a critical part of our purpose. We understand what the role of banks is, and the role that it plays in people's lives. And so there are things that are important to all of those stakeholders we talked about before that we know are essential to their lives. Starting a family and owning a home and sending kids off to college and having healthy lives, which includes healthy financial lives. And how do we bring value and solutions to people's lives at every aspect of that value chain? And so what goes along with that, though, are all these other social issues which are weighing on people, which historically you used to be able to leave, or companies would ask you to leave that stuff at home before you come to work. Don't bring that up in here. We're not talking about that. But now we are, because, younger generations have brought into play, and we were talking about this earlier, this marriage of the physical and the digital world. This confluence of physical and digital is we're always on. You can't check these social issues at the door anymore. You bring all that stuff with you to work because it's constantly with you. Even when you're at work, your phone's going off, you just got a breaking news alert from, whoever, the New York Times or whoever, about, some issue that happened, there was another shooting, And all this stuff is weighing on your employees as they're trying to be productive, and they're looking for help and support from their from their employer to acknowledge that these things are happening, and what can my employer do to help me work through it. There are times when I'm going to ask my employer to take a stand on some of this stuff because it's important to me, and it doesn't mean we always will or have to, but you do have to acknowledge that these things are happening in people's lives, and be prepared to manage the whole person. It used to be a time when you could just sort of manage the employee. Now you're managing a whole person who's got all of these other things that are happening in their lives, personally, things that are happening politically, socially, and it creates a great challenge for organizations, but you can't run from them. And it's just sort of redefining how we as leaders, I know your previous speaker was an HR expert, and she talked about what's in your toolbox, and being able to manage all of these social issues and being able to manage the whole person is a leadership expectation for leaders now and into the future.
Yeah. And I think that's great, but also very challenging, right? I know
Yeah.
that in the past 2 or 3 years, even being an employee and trying to bring your whole person to work
Yeah.
is difficult, right? We still don't know to what extent, or and
Yeah.
when do you check out and when you don't.
Which is why people are, I'll say, choosing different career paths as well. Because what COVID taught us and what COVID forced us to do is there is no separation between your personal and professional life. It's just your life now. Like you can't separate them. Like it's just your life, and you have to manage it as effectively as you possibly can. And whatever you do for work and your profession needs to align with your values as a person so that you can manage it all. That's what the whole flexibility around being in the office, not in the office, that's all about, because people know there is no blurring of the lines anymore. It's just my life, and I need to manage all of this stuff, and I need my employer to help me manage it all. And as leaders, yes, we take on a lot, and we have to also acknowledge our own trauma and stuff that as leaders we're going through, and acknowledge that we all need support, which is why leaders have to be more vulnerable in talking about the things that we are also going through while we're helping and supporting our teams. You also have to be willing to be vulnerable and say, hey, like, I'm not okay too. I'm not okay. And here's where I need support from others as well. So anyway, there's a lot I could say about that, but.
Yeah, I can imagine. Elizabeth, any thoughts there?
A couple of ones. One, as you were mentioned, there's a real correlation between purpose, engagement, and retention. So there is an importance why we believe that those that are engaged with the organization based on the purpose of the organization, thrive in the organization, they can bring their whole self to engage with the product as well as with the work that you're doing. So having those 3 pieces are important. The other thing that we're talking about, I think it's important because when we think about the contracts today that we have with organization, we're expecting organizations, companies to be so excited about force that they have impact on the society that we live and work. And that was not the way that we thought in the past of corporations. Corporations were there to make money, and that's all that people care about. And now we actually see corporations as being part of making society a better place, of being part of change, and not just sitting in the back. And that's why, as Greg was saying, our employees expect us to be engaged with some of the topics that are part of the society and have the point of view. And as you said, we will not engage in all the points of view, but there is the expectation that we talk about and we align to our values, and we're clear what our values are. And we see that people sometimes when they feel that we have not been clear enough about that, that's when we see attrition in most of the companies, not just in ours, where there's this disconnect between, I thought you were that kind of company, and now you are just not looking at these important topics that are impacting our health, from mental health to you talk about shootings or some things that are happening around us something that is, I would say, probably in the last 10 years have been clear. The companies cannot step away and say, this is not my role, this is actually part of your role as engaging with your employees.
Yeah, I really like, Greg, what you said about leadership being human as well, right? I think a lot of the discussion that we've had today is around what leadership can do to promote inclusion. But I think now we're also talking about how leadership sort of brings their own personal values and their own personal challenges into these new conversations. Elizabeth, you talk about, having to take a stance on certain things, but I know that that's challenging, very challenging. Like, where do you decide where you take a stance as a company? What happens if that differs slightly maybe from your personal stance? How do you have these conversations?
That happens a lot,
amongst
actually.
leadership? I know, like even internally for the economists,
I'm sure.
So I'm curious to hear how you navigate that, and how do you think that has changed as well throughout your careers?
I think Elizabeth said this earlier, but I think the first thing that you have to consider with any issue that crosses your desk, that it's how does it align to our business? Does it help us move our business forward in a way that is aligned with our goals and our priorities? Like, that's always the very first filter, because U.S. Bank is a bank, and so there's certain issues that we're just not going to weigh in on because we're not experts on it. We can't change it, and it doesn't really align to our business. And so that's number one. But the other thing is you start to think about, how does it impact any of our key stakeholder groups? Does it affect our employees? Does it affect our customers? And you start to think about, does it impact those that are closest to you and part of your constituent groups? The other part of your question is, oftentimes we have to make decisions, or as leaders, that don't align with our personal. Absolutely, that happens a lot, and there are things that I personally feel strongly about, but I always have to put the interest of the organization and the people we serve before my own wishes at times. But you navigate that because you keep the responsibility of what you're there to do is most central to everything. And it is challenging for leaders now, but I think we do have more tools and more resources that are available to help leaders lead through these challenging times. The issues are far more complex. Yep. There are far more potholes than there's ever been, but I also think that there are more tools that we all have to take advantage of. Conversations like this, convenings where we can learn. And what I think leaders have to do more of, though, is leaders have to, as leaders, we're always hardwired to show up with the answer, to be the quote unquote teacher. And now it's like actually okay for leaders to show up as a student and say, hey, I don't know, but I'm learning with you. And I say that a lot, that I'm learning every day, and I'm not always going to have the answer. And we all have to give each other some grace to actually be on this journey together.
I think that's really important. Elizabeth, any thoughts on that and how you see it?
Yeah, the thing that I will add, as a global company, we're always going to disappoint someone.
Yes.
Because what is a big priority here in the U.S. may not be a big priority. If we react to an act of hate here, there are many acts of hate that are happening for our employees. So we're constantly checking ourselves and saying, how do we communicate that we care about all our employees? We may react faster here in the U.S. just because we're senior, and we need to have this global mindset constantly. conversation back and forth so we can ensure that we have the tools that you need to support both our employees and their families around the world.
Great. I think, we're all learning as we go, so it's good to be able now to do it as communities, as companies, and include that. I don't know if anyone in the audience has any questions or thoughts on what we've discussed. I'm sure you do, if you have any specific questions. Yeah.
I'm ready for him.
Thank you. And if you can just introduce yourself and tell us.
Hi, my name is Leo Chan. I'm actually a professor in finance from Utah Valley University. I guess my question is more of direct to Greg. You use the sport analogy, and one of the problem I see, I used to taught at a HBCU, and majority of my students are not athletes, but more of my students in the finance class end up getting much better positions and doing much better economically and socially than their sports peers, and yet it's not celebrated in a sense in the community as with somebody being successful in the sports field, and then maybe that's something important, but somewhat related topic to that is in the society as a whole. There's a lot of criticism about CEO or certain high-tech executive getting enormous amount of money for the job that they hold. Nobody is outraged by the amount of money an athlete make or a coach make, and then especially when a coach get fired, they get they don't get no jobs or whatever. They get actually a really nice golden parachute package, and then 2 years later they can get another job. Nowhere in the business world where I know that a business leader can fail so spectacularly as a coach at a professional football team and get a lot of money to let go. And so it's more of a fairness question, and then the priority question when it comes to how the community see what is important and what is not important. It's important to be a successful academically in other fields versus somebody successful in sports, which is much more of a stereotypical image issue. So I know it's a broad question, but I'd like to see what your takes on that.
Yeah, there's a lot in that one.
I'm glad you asked Greg for that one.
Yeah, Elizabeth, do you want to tackle it? No, I got it, but I'd love to. First of all, let me say this. I use the sports analogy because they were two sports that typically you don't see people of color, and particularly black people, excel at. And the reason I use that example is because, the other point I'm trying to make in that is we've got a lot of Tiger Woodses and Serena Williams and Venus Williams in our corporations who don't get an opportunity to thrive. Like I was saying earlier, talent is distributed equally, opportunity is not. And we're leaving talent on the table by not removing barriers for employees to move up in the organization. I'll leave that one alone for a second. So the other part of your comment, and by the way, I went to an HBCU, so we can talk about that. But there's so much in that. We have to fix the systems that have made it more desirable for young people, particularly in low and moderate income communities, to pursue those careers and see that as the only way to success, because that's what's being celebrated. You mentioned sport. There is a system. There is an organization called AAU, which we're all familiar with, Amateur Athletic Association. If you can run a football, dribble a basketball, AAU is going to find you. And they're going to find you around 3rd, 4th grade. We don't do that for kids in STEM. There's no AAU looking for that prodigy kid in 3rd grade in the neighborhood who is just needs to be cultivated, needs to be nurtured, needs to be in the room with the best and brightest kids from across the country, just like AAU does. If you can dribble a basketball, they're going to put you in the right training programs. You're going to compete against the best competition, and you become LeBron James because they've been cultivating your talent from the time you were in grade school. And so, again, that's not something U.S. Bank can solve. But what I'm saying to you is we have to begin to have that conversation where organizations and institutions are helping to support community organizations that are doing that work. There are lots of nonprofits, and I'm sure Spotify, just like every other corporation, we're trying to do as much as we can to help enable the enablers, the folks in the community who are doing that work, boots on the ground, who are cultivating these kids that are, that are bright at these early ages, and they show up proficiency in STEM, but they're being discouraged because that's not the environment where that is cool. The kid who can dribble and dunk a basketball in 4th grade is way cooler, but they're in this environment where they don't see STEM as the pathway out of this situation because they don't know anybody that's made it out of this environment by STEM, but they know a lot of people who made it out by running a football and dunking a basketball. And so we have to fix these issues, which is why we're focused on this, this wealth gap, because so many of these societal issues and things that you're talking about are driven because we haven't solved the poverty question. The poverty question affects education, it affects healthcare, it affects public safety, it affects all these other things. And so if we can, as a bank, again, stay in our lane and do what we do well, if we can focus on the finance and the economics and help solve these wealth gaps as an industry, not just as an individual bank, but as an industry, we can help solve some of these larger problems that you're talking about. But anyway, we could do a whole session on just your question, honestly.
But I want to add some of the things that you were saying. Many of us in the tech industry have looked into creating programs that not only, and we have the internship people that are coming, students that are coming from STEM, from college, but also the non-traditional quality. So creating boot camps and engaging with organizations that help bring that new talent that may not have come through the path of college, that may not have come, but with a couple of weeks of real, or a couple of months, not weeks, but a couple of months of real coding exercises and applications, they can start coming into the tech world. So we're really looking at creating paths that are not the traditional path that we go to computer science school, but also other paths that will bring talent from diverse backgrounds to be able to participate in the economy and in the tech economy.
Is there another question in the audience, or yeah? Okay. And I guess I just have a follow-up, Elizabeth, because you were also at the intersection of music and tech, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you bring in, the creative side of some of your stakeholders, and how do they interact with, very different views of the world, I guess. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit about how that interaction between both worlds helps your strategy.
Yeah, so there are two programs that we have for a couple of years, and one called Equality, where we focus on women creators, and the other one is Sound Up, and that the Equality is for music, and the Sound Up is for podcasts. So, like other programs, we select, and then we ensure that they have the skills that they need and that they can tell their own stories. For example, for Sound Up, there's a selection process, there's a participation through specific learning, and acting and working with experts in the field, and then some of those become originals of Spotify. So you can find them in our own podcast. So going back to the word that Greg used, we are very intentional in looking at where do we have opportunities to build talent, both internally for the running of the organization, but also from the creators that may have not had access to systemic obstacles, and then we can remove those obstacles and create those opportunities.
Great. Well, we're near the end and close to happy hour. So just want to thank you both for a great session. You know, I think those three concepts, intentionality, accountability, and consistency, are really a thread that we can think through the entire day, right? Is you know, we talked about what you don't measure does not get managed. We talked about, you know, talking the talk but walking the walk. And I think, you know, this is a really sort of nice end to a day where we're talking about the same thing, but it's actually a lot of different things coming together. So I really appreciate your time. I don't know if you have any other sort of final words, and if not, I'll invite our audience to go and have a drink.
I think we better let them go to happy hour.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Elizabeth. It's been great to have you both, and to have those who stayed through the whole day. We really appreciate it, and you know, we'll be outside if you have any other questions.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Elizabeth.